What's up, guys? Welcome back to Everyday Money. Today what we're going to talk about is super important, and if you haven't watched any of my videos through to the end, I think that this one is going to be the one that you want to do that, because what we need to address is the inflation that is here right now and the inflation that is coming, because I don't think that the federal government is going to be able to keep a lid on this inflation. Over these last 12 months or so, the government has inflated the money supply so high, I mean higher than any time that I can see in history. It is staggering, the amount of money that we have pumped into the system, the amount that we have diluted the US dollar. And when we get into this, you'll see that they have diluted the dollar on just in one day, or in like 1 week or so. A very short period of time on this chart by like a factor of 4. We have increased the money supply on the M1 money supply, which is like your cash and very nearly cash type of things, like checking accounts, things of that nature. It went up by a factor of 4 in the span of like a very short period of time. Because in this time, just for coronavirus stimulus, we have spent, and by spend I mean borrowed, $4 trillion, which is about, it's a little bit over 100% of the total revenue that the United States government brings in every year, which is about $3.8 trillion. And so I want to get to how this is going to affect inflation and why I think that the federal government is going to have a very hard time fighting inflation versus when they had to fight it back in the 70s through the late 80s, and what that's going to mean for you. So if you look back in history, around the beginning of the 70s through the 80s, there was a period of very high rates of inflation, very high rates of interest. If you are old enough that you recall this, or if you talk to your parents about it, or your grandparents can probably tell you about, the time of maybe the 40s and 50s and coming into the 60s and the 70s with the inflation. What had happened was Lyndon Johnson had the Vietnam War going on. We were spending like crazy on that. We were spending like crazy on his Great Society initiatives. And then Richard Nixon came into office, and he wanted to spend in order to lower unemployment. And at the time, inflation was acceptable in order to lower unemployment. But they started diluting down the US dollar. And this is also, by the way, the time that they came off of the gold standard, where every dollar was backed by gold. And so the US dollar became a fiat currency, which always will have some inflationary and volatility aspects to it. They were concerned about unemployment, and so they were okay with spending a lot of money and inflation going up. Well, that quickly became a problem as prices started to climb, inflation started to run out of control, and what they had to do was the Fed had to increase their federal funds rate in order to control inflation. Now, really, how does that work? So when banks lend money, they can borrow money from the Fed, and they will charge them an interest rate. Right now, in 2021, that rate is almost zero, but back then it was quite a bit higher than that, and what they had to do was continue to run that rate up until they were in, the upper teens, the 14, 15, 16, 17%. And so when they would loan that money, instead of taking that as profit, they would essentially burn that money. And that is how they can take money out of circulation and reduce the amount of money in circulation and get a hold of inflation and bring it back down to a normal rate. Because some inflation is good. A 1 or 2% inflation keeps the economy moving and keeps people wanting to buy things. Because if you know that something is going to be 1 or 2% more expensive in the future, you are going to buy it right now. And that is good. It should keep wages going up. It should just keep everything moving. Whereas a deflationary economy, where things are going down, you will wait to buy things. And then, if people aren't buying things, companies go out of business, people lose their jobs, wages go down. So a small amount of inflation is good for the economy. But when inflation gets out of control, it starts to outpace those other factors such as income increasing, production increasing. And so the items that you buy are going to go up in price faster than you can afford it. And that is why the Fed tries to fight inflation and keep it at a reasonable level. Back in the 70s, the debt to GDP was at a much more reasonable about 35%. And so when they raise those rates, it also raises the amount that the government has to pay on the money that it has borrowed. So back in those days, you could raise the rates up to 17% to take that money out of circulation. The interest payments didn't go up to an unsustainable level because the debt level was not yet unsustainable. Which brings us to today. If you look at the M1 money chart again, from the end of the Great Recession, or from when that started, from when that started to the beginning of the coronavirus, it has ticked up at a higher pace than it has historically from like 1975 when this chart, what this chart shows. So once we get to this coronavirus pandemic, though, it is a straight line up where we have just pumped a bajillion dollars into the system. It's actually, I think it's somewhere around like $4 trillion just for coronavirus relief. We're talking about spending another $4 trillion on infrastructure right now. And for the last decade or so, we have been running our government debt at 100% of GDP, which means that for the entire economic output of the country, we have that much debt as well. And it has been on a upward slope since forever, essentially. And now we have gotten to a 100% debt to GDP. That is very not good for the Fed fighting inflation in the future and right now, because if they raise the federal funds borrowing rate, that will start sucking money out of the economy, start sucking money out of circulation. But it will also increase the federal government's interest obligations on the federal debt. Now, right now, the net federal debt interest payments are right around like $350 billion a year. The federal funds rate right now is right around 0%. So it's very affordable for us to maintain this servicing level of that debt. However, if you need to raise the rates any significant amount, I mean, even probably up to 2 or 3 or 4%, you are looking at a massive increase in those debt payments that the federal government just can't afford. And, you know, if we had to get back up into the teens in order for this inflation to get under control, not only would things become unaffordable for the everyday American, and it would definitely have a major impact on the economy because borrowing costs would go up. Corporations couldn't borrow money to grow and then to make new products, to pay people. Interest rates on cars, credit cards, homes, everything would go up. If you don't have a fixed rate loan right now, now is the time to get it. Now is the time to lock in a fixed rate loan for a long period of time at a low interest rate, because if you have an adjustable rate loan or if you are going to purchase something in the future, the interest rate is going to be much higher because they are going to have to raise that federal funds rate in order to combat this inflation. For the federal government, imagine if it went up to 4%. And so we're looking at, you know, I know essentially 4 times 0 is 0, but if it went up by a factor of 4 and our debt payments go up by a factor of 4, if our net debt payments go up to 4 times $350 billion, I mean, what are we looking at? $1.4 trillion. So we would be spending a third of our total federal budget on just servicing that debt. And that is where they're going to run into a rock and a hard place situation where they need to fight the interest or the inflation rates because they are going up at probably a substantial amount. I mean, they can't not go up by a substantial amount with the way that they have printed money and diluted the value of the dollar. So they're going to need to try to fight that inflation, but at the same time that they are trying to fight that inflation, they are going to be pushing their own debt obligation payments through the roof to a point that would be unsustainable. You know, if we went back up to over 10% interest in the federal funds rate, we would probably be looking at the majority of the United States government budget every year going to service that debt, and that would be everything. That would take the place of Medicare, Medicaid, defense, infrastructure, education, everything. Everything that the federal government would be doing, disaster relief, etc., would be taken up by spending for this to try to fight this inflation rate. So guys, that's why I think that the inflation rate is going to be going up at probably a pretty significant amount. We've already seen that the April to April inflation increase is 4.2%. Now that is between April of 2021 and April of 2020. In April of 2020, things were shut down and we were probably more in a more deflationary type of situation without having the numbers right in front of me. But if you look at April's rate, it was 0.8% in 2021. If you extrapolate that over 12 months, if you want to take one data point and extrapolate that over 12 months without doing the calculations right in front of me, that would be an inflation rate of like somewhere around 9 or 10% for the entire year, which obviously is not a great thing to be in. I think that there is inflation coming. There are some strategies to try to mitigate your effects to inflation, but that's probably for another video. We are getting a little long in this one, but I appreciate you guys watching today. If you haven't yet, hit that thumbs up button for me. That really helps out in the YouTube algorithm. Be sure to subscribe to this channel to grow your wealth, increase your success, put you on the road to financial freedom. Again, I appreciate you guys watching today, and I will see you on the next one.